He was the final king of Númenor. Despite an unlikely early friendship with one of the faithful and being known for generosity toward his people, he would plunge the island realm into darkness and destruction. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the life and travels of Ar-Pharazon. Pharazon is born in 3118 of the Second Age, the son of Gimilcad. Gimilcad and his brother, Inziledun, are the sons of Númenor's king, Ar-Gimilzor. Gimilcad and Isilidun would grow to lead the two separate factions of Númenor. Gimilcad leads the King's Men, who over the previous centuries of rule had turned their people against the Valar, as well as the elves of Middle-earth. Isilidun would ascend to his father's throne and take the name Tar-Palantir and lead the Faithful, the far less numerous group that attempts to bring their people back to their traditional ways and holding the Valar in high honor. In his youth, Pharazon held an unlikely friendship with Amandil, who is among the faithful Númenóreans. Both Pharazon and Amandil would become known as great captains of Númenor. While Amandil is described as a great sea captain, Pharazon's renown would come on land. He becomes a great commander of Númenor's armies as they wage war with Sauron in Middle-earth. His father Gimilcad dies in 3243 at the age of 199, a relatively young age for one of the royal line of Númenor. Hearing this news, Pharazon returns to Númenor, for he is next in line for the leadership of the King's Men. When he comes home to the island nation, Pharazon is generous with the wealth he had acquired during his time in Middle-earth. Thus, the hearts of the people are turned toward him, and he fights against his uncle's efforts to lead the nation to repent of their wrongdoings toward the Valar and the Eldar. Pharazon remains in Númenor, leading the King's Men until 3255, when Tar-Palantir dies. Upon his uncle's death, Pharazon forces Tar-Palantir's daughter Míriel into marriage. Now here we have an interesting situation because there's two versions of this part of the story. In Tolkien's first account, which was published in the Silmarillion, it says, "But Pharazon took her to wife against her will, doing evil in this, and evil also, in that the laws of Númenor did not permit the marriage, even in the royal house, of those more nearly akin than cousins in the second degree. And when they were wedded, he seized the scepter into his own hand." Now this is the account that most will no doubt be familiar with, but it's interesting to note that Tolkien wrote a later version of the story that appears in the History of Middle-earth Volume 12, where it seems Míriel may have been as devious as her cousin. Pharazon arose and came to her, and she was glad, and forsook the allegiance of her father for the time, being enamored of Pharazon. And in this they broke the laws of Númenor that forbade marriage even in the royal house, between those more nearly akin than cousins in the second degree. But they were too powerful for any to gainsay them, and when they were wedded, she yielded the scepter to Pharazon. It's worth noting that this was not the account that Christopher Tolkien chose to include in the Silmarillion, as it was never published and the original account was far more complete. Still, it's interesting to see that Tolkien was at one time considering a completely different approach to Tar-Míriel and Pharazon. Returning to the original account, Pharazon takes Tar-Míriel as his wife by force, and takes the title Ar-Pharazon and the Scepter of Númenor. He changes Míriel's name from one that is in line with the faithful Númenóreans to one that rejects the language of the Eldar, Ar-Zimrafel. It's also worth noting that despite their extremely opposing positions, Ar-Pharazon still had Amandil on his council as one of his advisors. Soon after he takes over as king, Ar-Pharazon receives word that Sauron has been attacking the Númenórean settlements in Middle-earth. Sauron makes boastful claims, declaring himself titles like King of Men and Lord of the Earth. Driven by his pride and arrogance, Ar-Pharazon decides that he will claim the title King of Men and put Sauron in his place. For the next 5 years, he assembles a fleet to make a great war upon the Dark Lord. In 3261, this fleet lands at the haven of Umbar, marching across the lands of Harad and on to Mordor. The splendor of Pharazon's force is so great, and his army so vast, that Sauron's armies desert him, leaving him alone in the face of the mighty Númenóreans. Knowing he cannot defeat Ar-Pharazon in battle, Sauron once again assumes his fair form, surrendering to the king. Ar-Pharazon takes Sauron back to Númenor as a hostage, in an effort to prevent his servants from further attacking Númenórean settlements of Middle-earth. This works directly into Sauron's plans. It is said that as soon as he stepped foot upon the island, he began corrupting the hearts and minds of the Númenóreans, and none did he affect greater than their very king. Sauron speaks to Ar-Pharazon with great flattery, and uses his own knowledge and power to help the king gain whatever he desired. In just 3 short years, Sauron goes from being a prisoner to being the chief advisor to the king. Sauron teaches many things to the people of Númenor, primarily that the Valar were not to be trusted, and that darkness alone was worshipful. In secret, Pharazon speaks with Sauron, desiring to know more about this Lord of Darkness. Sauron tells the king of Melkor, the giver of freedom, and that Eru Ilúvatar was merely a lie of the Valar, meant to keep the men from rebelling. Thus, Ar-Pharazon and many of the Númenóreans turned to the worship of Melkor. At this time, Sauron also convinces Ar-Pharazon to kill the White Tree of Nimloth, the last symbol of the ancient friendship with the Valar and the Elves. Amandil, having no doubt that Sauron's advice would eventually be heeded by the king, tells his family. His grandson, Isildur, sneaks into the king's court and in disguise steals a fruit from the White Tree, though he is grievously wounded in the deed. Upon hearing the news of the fruit's theft, Ar-Pharazon has the tree cut down and burned in the newly built Temple of Melkor. Over the decades, the Númenóreans would become brutal oppressors over the peoples of their settlements in Middle-earth. They even turned to slavery and human sacrifice of both these peoples and those among the faithful. Though at the king's command, neither Amandil nor any of his family were to be assailed. During his rule, Ar-Pharazon and his people are increasingly obsessed with material things. Basking in their decadence, Ar-Pharazon comes to be known as Ar-Pharazon the Golden. Despite their worship to the Dark Lord, the Númenóreans do not stave off death, as they so desperately craved. In fact, many have shorter lifespans than those who came before. In 3309, Ar-Pharazon is 191 years old, just 8 years younger than his father was when he died. Growing old, he fears his inevitable death and becomes desperate. Finally, Sauron gives his last advice to the king. The Valar have possessed themselves of the land where there is no death, and they lie to you concerning it, hiding it as best they may because of their avarice and their fear, lest the kings of men should wrest from them the deathless realm and rule the world in their stead. And though, doubtless, the gift of life unending is not for all, but only for such as are worthy, being men of might and pride and great lineage, yet against all justice it is done that this gift, which is his due, should be withheld from the King of Kings, Ar-Pharazon, mightiest of the sons of the earth, to whom Manwe alone can be compared, if even he. But great kings do not brook denials, and take what is their due. Convinced that he could gain immortality by force, Ar-Pharazon orders the building of the Great Armament in 3310. And for the next 9 years, the evil Númenóreans would build a great fleet to make war upon the Valar. During the construction, the Valar would send warnings to Númenor as great thunderclouds, taking the shape of eagles that would appear in the western sky. However, Ar-Pharazon and most of his people simply hardened their hearts all the more, and the king proclaimed, "The lords of the west have plotted against us. They strike first,
The next blow shall be ours.
Finally, in 3319, Ar-Pharazon travels to the western coast of Númenor, and on his ship, sitting upon his throne in full armor, he orders the launching of the fleet. The great armament sails to the uttermost west, passing the Isle of Tol Eressëa, and they anchor near the coast of Valinor. The mortal king, upon seeing the splendor of the great mountain of Taniquetil, takes pause, and we are told he becomes afraid and even considers ordering a retreat. However, his pride leads him to proceed with the assault. Thus, the army of mortal men comes to the immortal lands. They march to the elven city of Tirion, where they make camp. Ar-Pharazon the Golden declares that the land of the Valar is now his, if none dared challenge him for it. The Valar call on Eru himself for aid, for their duty was to aid and not harm the elves and men of Middle-earth. Eru answers their call, and in that moment, he breaks the very world. A chasm opens to divide the mortal lands of Middle-earth and the blessed realm of Valinor. As Númenor itself is swallowed by the sea, Ar-Pharazon and his fleet are buried within the chasm. Míriel dies along with a great many Númenóreans in the destruction of their island realm. However, the line of Elros would live on in Elendil, Isildur, and Anarion, as they lead the ships of the faithful to the coasts of Middle-earth. There they would found the realms of Gondor and Arnor. As for Pharazon, there would come a day many years after Númenor's destruction that the kings of Gondor would raise a great pillar in Umbar to commemorate him, not for the evil he brought upon their ancestors, but to commemorate the humbling of Sauron. When Sauron would later retake Umbar for his own, he would have this monument destroyed, thus destroying the final relic of the king who would plunge the once great island nation further into darkness. The king who would lead to his own destruction, and that of Númenor. Now, this is no doubt one of the most interesting characters we'll see in the Rings of Power series. I'm curious to see how this character develops into the tyrant he will become. And while no doubt Tar-Míriel will be adapted from the better-known version, I wonder if they might play with the idea that she might be convinced to ally with Pharazon. Let me know in the comments what you think about Ar-Pharazon and what his arc might be in the show. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Listen Me the Cinda, Mandu Pandu, Andrew Carlisle, Sky Carcass, Slidebelts, Dane Ragnarsson, Salim Rahman, Zetrock, Berto Berg, Grand Strategy Nerd, Graham Darricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description and purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.